Great. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. So we have a lot of topics to cover with our distinguished panelists, so I think we'll just kind of jump into it. Just really quickly, intros. Ben is leading lots. Oh, sorry, Ben.
Oh, no problem. So I'm working at HSBC. I'm the head of HSBC Labs. What we do in the labs is we focus on emerging technology, researching in particular digital assets and Web3, and looking at ways that we can embrace these ideas back in traditional finance.
Emilio?
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Emilio. I work in Aave Labs. My role is VP of Engineering, so I supervise everything related to development around the Aave protocol for the part that is dedicated by Aave Labs as a contributor to the Aave DAO, and especially regarding the Aave protocol, the new version of the Aave protocol, Aave v4, Go, the integration with Chainlink and CCIP, and everything related to that. Yeah.
Great. Tom?
Hi, I'm Tom Menner, the CTO of SBI Digital Markets, based in Singapore. SBI is not the State Bank of India. It is a Japanese financial conglomerate. Our little piece of the SBI family is very focused on digital assets specifically. And for us, it's all about distribution of digital assets for capital markets and institutional investors in particular.
Great, thank you. So Tom and Ben are two of the people I've seen really driving the capital markets TradFi world forward in terms of actually using blockchains and smart contracts in a useful way. And Emilio has a very storied and well-deserved reputation for being very involved and instrumental to building Aave, the leading lending market and one of the key protocols that kicked off the whole DeFi trend. So I think it's a really great panel we have here and very smart representative group from both the DeFi community and the TradFi community. So that brings me to my first kind of line of questions is how do you believe that DeFi and TradFi will become each other's users in the coming years? How do you see that evolving? Ben, I'll start with you.
Sure. I have both personal and I think for the traditional in the bank sense, I'll start with the bank. Look, we're building on the shoulders of giants. A lot of the actual smart contract and other capabilities came from Web3, came from DeFi. Credit where credit's due. Thank you. I mean, this is things that we actually need to provide better customer experiences and new ones. I think that's where the opportunity is that we can take these concepts that have come from Web3 and make it work in a traditional banking setting. These could be anything from the primitives like identity to looking at how we can do decentralized identity, making that work for cross-border type scenarios in a trustworthy manner, and being able to make new programmability on existing real-world assets. That's the big opportunity. Personally, yeah, I use both the bank and I use my crypto and Bitcoin. I mean, I think that many of us are actually in both worlds already, unless you've gone full cypherpunk. And this is where I think we need to get to, is to take more of the ideas that are continually coming out of the public space in Web3 and make that work in regulated institutions.
But do you see TradFi becoming a user of DeFi at some point?
Absolutely. We're already using the smart contract capability for many of our tokenized real-world assets. HSBC has announced here in Hong Kong tokenized bonds. We're also doing tokenized gold. We've also made announcements that we're going to be providing institutional custody. And increasingly, we're going to need to make that work in many, many different regions. These are DeFi primitives that have started in that community, but we can also theoretically, with regulation, make that even work on other ledgers, public permissionless ledgers being a potential option. This is a future state, but one that it's in a journey. It's not going to happen overnight, but in many ways, I think the institutions are here. I'm here. And so that's going to keep happening. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you. Emilio, how do you feel DeFi and TradFi can work together?
Well, my feeling here, which I also mentioned yesterday in a different context in the other panel I was participating in, is that, like, the way I see it, I believe that in the long term, probably we will see DeFi kind of disappear in the sense that it will become the hidden layer of finance. So we will have a variety of products and tools that we already use today and in TradFi that today they work kind of like a black box, right? Because you have access to tools that like they work because they've been tested for a long time, and with all the different aspects that involve like participating in protocol in tools and products that are part of the finance as we know today. And those will actually use DeFi under the hood. So like users will not even be feeling in many cases that they are using blockchain, they are using DeFi. They will be using this tool in very similar ways as they use today, but with all the additional benefits that were mentioned before that are brought to us by blockchain and by DeFi, which is transparency, which is ease of access, and everything related to that. Yeah.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you. So Tom, how do you feel that TradFi user base and the TradFi systems will eventually utilize DeFi, or how will DeFi interact with the TradFi community?
So I think to Ben's point, really you can look at this, I think, on two different levels. One is the financial market infrastructure. So if this technology, DLT, allows for operational efficiency, for example, or allows for a network effect such that I can open up new distribution channels for bringing a sell side, an issuance side, to the buy side, that actually introduces quite a bit of reason for actually going down this path, particularly from a TradFi perspective. The second way of looking at this, and so that implies that there needs to be a network effect in order for this to be really of value, again, to traditional finance. The other way of looking at this as DeFi as an asset class itself. So for example, cryptocurrency, the value of that particular asset is, in essence, whatever the market deems it to be. TradFi, up until the ETFs recently came out, has been skeptical of dancing in that space. So you have the ETFs that sort of open the door for that, and the regulators allow that to happen. One thing that, for example, we're doing at SBI Digital Markets is looking at, okay, how do we structure these kinds of assets, the DeFi assets and the crypto assets, in such a way that it becomes palatable and acceptable both to the regulators and to the buy side. So in essence, this technology facilitates introduction of new asset classes, whether we're talking about tokenizing real-world assets or whether it's the crypto asset itself being structured in a way that is accessible to institutional and regulated investors.
Yeah, I was much more talking or asking or thinking about the second use case where how does the TradFi money and all the TradFi user kind of capital end up interacting with DeFi through the TradFi systems, right? So
to that point, it's going to be about the kinds of financial services that DeFi makes available to TradFi. So for example, if I'm talking about an asset, let's say a tokenized real-world asset that I purchased from HSBC, if in the DeFi world you provide a secondary service to me, whether it's a secondary market, like a digital exchange, whether it's, say, collateralization as a service, whether it's a liquidity pool, suddenly that token becomes much more valuable to me because it's not just representing the real-world asset that HSBC is underwriting, but now that token has liquidity and velocity that, again, given the network effect, given the other DeFi services that are available to me that I can use that token for, increases the value of that token.
yeah, that's kind of the sentiment that I have about all this.
Yeah, I mean, if we, to this point that was just mentioned, it's kind of already happening. If you think of as Bitcoin as an asset that is exogenous to Ethereum, for example, and all the different wrapped versions that are made available by the wrapped BTC DAO or Coinbase BTC or whatever, so many other tokenized versions of BTC on-chain, it's kind of similar, right? I mean, there is the difference that like the original asset is also decentralized, so it comes with much smaller regulatory footprint, so it's much easier to handle. But it's also true to that point that like by tokenizing Bitcoin on Ethereum, for example, you increase its velocity because then you can use it in DeFi. You can make it more liquid on-chain. You can use it in the smart contracts, which is something that you cannot do natively on the Bitcoin network. So if we think about this in the same shape and form as it could be another RWA asset, I think there are a lot of similarities in there.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of what we're seeing. We're seeing different forms of wrapping of assets, right? We're seeing things like BlackRock's BIDL or any number of traditional tokenized real-world assets that are basically the tokenized wrapping of some existing financial product. Then we're seeing the wrapping of that, and then we're seeing the wrapping of crypto assets, and we're seeing it go the other direction when you put crypto assets in an ETF, which is also a kind of legal wrapper around that product. So what I'm seeing is the crypto assets being turned into legally compliant financial products for the TradFi community, and the ETF being a kind of legal wrapper for that. And then I'm seeing assets from the TradFi community, like treasuries or any number of other assets that are now being turned into on-chain forms. And then that on-chain version of that traditional asset then gets a lot of benefits from what Tom said when they start to interact with the composable world of DeFi, the DEX world, the lending world, all these different kind of core building blocks that then get pulled in around that asset. One of the key building blocks that I think is still in the process of being built, though, is interoperability and the ability for that asset, to move across chains and access, the purchasing power of the other chains. So, don't want to bias you. I think you already know what my views are. I'm sure unless you have a twin, I'm sure we've talked about it quite a bit. You know my views, but so won't bias you here. On the stage, love to hear your views about the importance of interoperability and the role it could play in making all of this DeFi, TradFi connection, real-world assets, digital asset adoption more successful. So I like consistency. So I'm just gonna begin again with Ben. Ben, please go ahead.
Interoperability is a very long word, and I said in the other panel, we've not solved it at HSBC. We are still working on this challenge, and it's not been a new challenge. We've had integration, as we were talking about in the other panel as well. We've had many integration challenges for a while. We're going to need to, in this new world, be able to do interoperability between UTXO and account-based structures. We're going to need to be likely doing private-to-private DLT interoperability. We may also be looking at private to permission or private even to public one day. This is going to create a lot of challenges as we try to express where is liquidity, what is the smart contract programmability that we're trying to work across all these different ledgers. And that's great, actually. I think the end result is we're not going to have a single ledger. We're going to have many, many ledgers. The ledger, of course, will be one of which is inside of our bank, but that may be expressing the asset on different ledgers that provide different capabilities to many different types of users. And in often cases depend on what the regulator allows in particular regions. But I think once we have that solution in place, it allows us to now connect many of the dots together. What I see happening in the public permissionless space will allow us to address many of the challenges we have in cross-border scenarios. When I look at some of the challenges we have even within a single region, even a private blockchain can give us some ability to go private to other clients where they may be doing treasury management and still want to do programmability of their asset on their own private ledger with privacy to themselves. These are great ways of using interoperability in both settings.
Right, so what you're seeing is that there's a number of chains that you have. There's a number of chains that the counterparties have.
Many, many chains.
Many different chains, private chains, public chains. Why do you think there's, as a caveat, why is there such an explosion of so many chains now?
I look at Web3. We can't even ourselves decide which chain we're going to all use. And if at the moment we did, we would immediately find some technology that's a little bit better and then immediately start, whipping our head around to say we're going to go start building and deploying on that. It's the same way in traditional finance, but I do think in Web3, this space just moves a lot faster. And that's not going to stop anytime soon. So then we're naturally going to need interoperability to those new standards. And in many ways as a bank, one that's been around for a while, this stuff doesn't go away very quickly. It's sticky, it's infrastructure, it's things that we have to support, whether it's for the government or a client or just because that's the way we've always done things. So we'll need interoperability to be able to keep pivoting to the latest and greatest things that are exploring on that.
Right, and while the chains might change, the way to do interoperability will likely stay the same because that'll be a reusable resource.
Ideally.
That continually allows you to interact with more and more chain technologies over time.
Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. Emilio, how do you feel cross-chain connectivity and interoperability will play a role in making the RWA not digital asset, crypto. The crypto trend, like how will interoperability accelerate that?
I mean, I think to the point of many chains, why there is this explosion and this need for interoperability, I think it comes down to basic needs. So institutionals have certain needs. Users that want to use permissionless public ledgers have other needs. Banks might have other needs, and so on and so forth. And that's why, for example, you might want to have a private ledger where you implement your, own KYC ML rules, and you have your own certain set of assets that you operate with, and your certain set of smart contracts that you mentioned before. But also, these different needs create opportunities, right? So maybe as an institution that I have my own private ledger, I see that there is an opportunity to capture on another ledger that might be public, for example, where I might take one subset of my assets and want to migrate them to let users actually use in other tools that are available on that particular public ledger, right? And that's where the need for multiple chains and the need for interoperability between these chains comes up. It's like covering everyone's needs and allowing everyone to take the opportunities that they want to take, right? And so from that particular, if we start from that particular point of view, I do agree that probably even when the needs change and the tools that will satisfy these needs change, but probably the way that we will create to let them operate together will probably remain very similar or the same. We see in crypto, like we don't really need to go to real-world assets or institutionals because we have the same needs even in crypto. So Go, for example, I mentioned with you before, why we had the need to bring Go to different chains because we had users that want to use Go on a variety of different networks. How do we do that? So when we sat down and started thinking users want to use Go or on Arbitrum, Optimism, or Avalanche, or whatever other network where Aave is available. How do we do that? How do we satisfy this need? And how do we let these users take these opportunities in a way that works with the less friction possible, right? And we have seen how that worked in the past, and then you start seeing a variety of different bridges that might or might not get exploited with five different versions of USDC on one network, and then the user then needs to trade between one or another to move from a network to another. And from that perspective, we were okay, we actually want to have a version of Go that would be canonical across all the networks so that the user can capture these opportunities with the less friction possible. That's the reason why we decided to use a canonical implementation that uses CCIP under the hood, because this way we managed to satisfy this need and allow users to get these opportunities with the less friction that we could think of. And this is going to be exactly the same for other assets that will come to naturally from TradFi to crypto as it's already happening.
Yeah, I think having a single canonical version is pretty valuable because otherwise people will make multiple versions, which is an even bigger problem in TradFi than it is in DeFi because the regulations won't be a fan of the multiple different versions. And beyond that, I think the DeFi world evolves at a different pace, and so the economic pressures that you felt and the kind of amount of demand that you experienced pretty quickly relative to the size of the whole system you have it was a large amount of demand relative to the size of the system, and so you had to move quickly to solve a problem, right? I think the same the same economic pressures exist in TradFi. They just take longer to accumulate, and then when they accumulate, I think you're right that the fundamental technical problems are the same, and the technical decisions are the same, because it's the same technical problem.
There is the legal then, right?
There's also legal and compliance and regulation, but yes.
The legal is the,
You always have that additional level,
Yeah.
but the initial kind
Exactly.
of security decisions are often the same, or design decisions, and then you have to layer on the compliance and legal. But Tom, definitely really want to hear your views on importance of interoperability, cross-chain connectivity, how that relates to the success of a digital asset, a token. How do you see that?
Right. To your point, Sergey, the technical issues are pretty much the same. And ultimately, while they're issues at a technical level, fundamentally, they're business problems. So me being a regulated financial entity, I have to worry about compliance and regulatory aspects and risk. So that's also why the TradFi will move much slower in terms of technical implementations than the DeFi world. But at the end of the day, my investors aren't really going to care whether it's a digital asset or if it's a real world asset. They just care that it's an asset that they want to invest in, and there's some rate of return and some risk measurement of that asset. So what I want to be able to do is go to an issuer like HSBC, and Ben comes to me and says, hey, Tom, I issued a digital bond, whether it's tokenized or whether it's digitally native. I want to be able to offer him and say, hey, Ben, I can list it on an exchange in Switzerland, an exchange in Japan, an exchange in Singapore. And, oh, by the way, it'll be instantaneous settlement if somebody purchased that asset, and I can immediately freeze those other two listings on the other exchanges, so we're not duplicating. And, oh, by the way, with that instantaneous settlement, we have maybe DLT-based corporate actions that follow that, and post-trade activities. So I'm squeezing out operational efficiency. I'm using that technology to do things like multiple listings. I'm providing him, as a service, multiple distribution channels. Now, it may be the case that Emilio, via Aave, says, well, hey, if you've got that tokenized bond, I can stick it in a liquidity pool over here on Avalanche or over a collateralization service that's part of my DeFi structure. Well, okay, now I'm talking about taking wherever it originated, the issuance of that digital bond, listing on multiple exchanges, which are probably on different protocols themselves. Maybe it's a Corda endpoint, maybe it's an Ethereum endpoint, maybe it's a Besu endpoint. And now also sending it over to a secondary financial service that's being provided by Avalanche. In order to facilitate all that, that's some very serious plumbing from an integration standpoint. And I'm really focused on that financial application layer. I don't want to deal with the plumbing whatsoever, that integration problem. If only I could find a technical vendor that was addressing that.
That's really funny. I'm going to show that to all future panelists and see how you do that. I think the more advanced use case that you just defined, where you're providing all this value, cross-chain listings so the liquidity is reusable, corporate action stuff, post-trade events, all of this requires, as you accurately put it, a lot of plumbing. And you and your team, as I understand it, want to build the application. You don't want to have to build the infrastructure.
Correct.
Emilio, you and your team want to build the application. You don't want to have to build the infrastructure. Ben, same for you, right? Absolutely. You don't want to build the infrastructure. You want to have infrastructure that allows applications like this to come into existence, operate across multiple exchanges on multiple chains, multiple DeFi kind of protocols can plug in at some point as well. They're all on their respective chains. We've seen multiple DeFi teams in the public chain world launch their own L2s. So everyone's just getting their own chain at this point. And I think that's really the world that we're going to be in for the next 5 to 10 years, no matter what, is the explosion in the amount of chains, the explosion in value across all of those chains. And the word that I always come back to when I think about interoperability and cross-chain is really liquidity. So it really just boils down to where is the liquidity that's going to use your application. That liquidity doesn't exist on any one chain. It exists on hundreds, thousands of different chains. And frankly, you should be able to build an application that accesses all the liquidity. And the cost of you building that application should be extremely low, because when you build an application on the internet, you access all internet users, right? You don't have to make a selective choice between, I'm going to build an application in this language, and that means I only get 20% of the internet or 30% of the internet. You just launch on the internet, and you get all of the internet users being able to access your application, regardless of the browser they use or whatever. So it's about users and eyeballs in the internet, and it's about liquidity in like this version of the internet, because we're talking about financial assets and transactions. And then on top of the ability to access all of that liquidity, like Tom's example, you're on those 3 exchanges because you want access to more liquidity, right? You want the asset available to more markets. So liquidity is a super powerful force in both the DeFi public chain world. It's one of the main, or maybe the main driving force of that whole thing, of that whole movement. And in the TradFi world, it's liquidity. That's what drives the success of the financial products. So fundamentally, we're all looking down at the same force and asking ourselves, how do we get this massively important force of liquidity to successfully interact with our applications, right? And then the exciting thing is that once that interoperability problem is actually solved, you can have your applications interact with each other for even more value to each other. That's kind of the theme and the idea that I find even more interesting, right? Is how can all of your different applications and assets interact in addition to the value of getting more liquidity to interact with your application. That's extremely exciting, in my opinion. So we have limited time, but there is an important question about compliance. I think compliance sits on top of all of these problems, and we should discuss it. But we only have 3 to 5 minutes, something like that. So this very complex, very convoluted topic will have to be explained very quickly. So Ben, please go ahead. What are your feelings about the importance of compliance when it comes to DeFi and TradFi?
Incredibly important. Not going away anytime soon, and I'm sure of that. The most important aspect is like activity, like risk, like control. And even as we make these new ecosystems and new capabilities, we're still beholden to as a regulated bank to all the existing compliance that apply to any traditional financial asset. I think then some of the most key controls that we have in traditional finance, which do differ from a decentralized finance type ecosystem, is identity. And the identity standards are things that are being innovated on in the Web3 space. Decentralized identity can be partnered with a lot of the DeFi protocols to make an institutional DeFi. And if we can apply those concepts, I think it's not only solving compliance, it in many ways will create a better customer experience. These Web3 concepts can give a better traditional finance experience, enable digital assets, and open up the potential to offer these assets on entirely new ledgers, public permissionless, with permissioned assets that could be fully compliant, depending on if the regulator allows it. And I think that's what we're always going to be finding, is that this technology is being pushed quite quickly in the Web3 space, and we're going to be looking very closely to say, what can we do to make sure it can happen, but in a compliant manner.
Got it. But identity is one of the first unlocks that needs to happen.
It's the biggest primitive that we have to start with. It gives us identity, which is important, but it also gives us self-custody. If it's a self-sovereign identity, that's the wallet. That's a wallet. So that means you're taking ownership of something. Before you can speculate on an asset, you need to make sure that we can own your own information. And that's where it has to start.
Makes sense. Emilio, compliance, your favorite word. Like rapid word association, compliance. Emilio's like,
I run away. No, just kidding. I mean, from a crypto perspective, from a crypto native perspective, what I think is that if we really want this marriage to happen between traditional finance and the crypto space and DeFi, we need to be willing to do some sacrifices also on certain principles that I'm pretty sure, like the crypto, traditionalists will turn up their nose about. Yeah, the purists
in the robes.
Yes, exactly. Turn up their nose about that. But a blockchain has many benefits besides decentralization. And as always, we have been saying decentralization is a spectrum, right? we go to full custodianship of full centralization to centralization dependency to complete permissionless protocols and systems and assets. And inevitably to be able to welcome these assets that come from traditional finance and to be able to accommodate the compliance requirements that come with them, we will need to make some sacrifice to make the whole thing accessible to everyone, and the benefits, the multiple benefits that blockchain has for everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think basically, if you want all of that liquidity, and the liquidity has the requirement of being compliant, you kind of have to be compliant to some degree. Otherwise, you're not getting the liquidity. And someone else, a competitor, will become compliant, and they'll get the liquidity. And that's not the situation anyone wants, right?
Yeah.
You want to be the one getting the liquidity because you can meet the conditions of it. I totally get the whole purist point, and I totally understand it, and in many ways I agree with it. But the reality is that the whole kind of libertarian mindset is based on choice, right? So the whole libertarian mindset is deeply rooted in the blockchain industry's beginning. And libertarian mindset says, hey, you don't want to do something, you don't have to do it. So if you don't want to use a certain financial product in a certain format, you don't have to prove identity. You don't have to do certain things. That's fine. You can use some other product, some other version of that product that doesn't require that. But there might be a deeper market with more liquidity over there because there's a lot more liquidity that comes in the compliant format for that market or that product. So I just view it from the libertarian point of view of we should just make infrastructure and systems and applications that build the best financial products, and then everyone can decide what they do or don't want to disclose or how they do or don't want to participate. It's just kind of,
100%.
But I get the view that people would have on that. So Tom, how do you feel compliance fits in?
Okay, in our final waning seconds here.
No, go ahead, it's fine. It's our conference.
This global liquidity that you and I both fantasize about, and I emphasize the word fantasize, but it comes with a very real challenge other than the pure technical challenge, which I'm sure Ben is well aware of, and that is the moment that this asset that we're talking about crosses a jurisdictional boundary. Suddenly I'm bound by a completely different regulator's view on what this asset is, what it represents, how it can be handled. So I could take Ben's digital bond or tokenized bond, again, listed in those 3 exchanges in my scenario, and then Emilio buys it, and he has it in his wallet in Italy. Well, the way that Italy or the European Union looks at that tokenized asset may be completely different from the way Singapore looks at it, or the US, or Hong Kong, or what have you. So it's really those boundary edge cases that won't necessarily be solved at the interoperability level. That might be solved maybe at a smart contract level, might be solved at a network governance layer, could be an Oracle, but somehow if I'm going to provide this liquidity to Ben as an issuer or Emilio as a buyer, I need to be able to account for that jurisdictional difference across that interoperability scenario.
That's interesting. It could be an oracle. That's an interesting idea. You could have an oracle define and manage compliance. That's interesting.
New product.
We should look into that. We should really look into that.
Only there was somebody looking into
If there was only somebody making oracles in the TradFi and DeFi space that was interested in solving these compliance problems, right? That's... if only that existed. Wink, wink. But yeah, so I think it's a very serious problem that if you want all of this interaction to happen, if you want a single internet of contracts where HSBC, SBI, Aave, all of these things are interacting, all of this global liquidity is happening in the ways that we've discussed, you need to meet the compliance requirements of not just a single jurisdiction, but many jurisdictions. And so you need a system where you can codify those compliance requirements. You need a system to write in the data that proves compliance, like identity proofs or AML, KYC, know your transaction proofs, basically write in information. And then you need the system to verify that the data is correct, right? That's kind of, not surprisingly, the approach we have, where the data oracles write in the compliance data, the cross-chain system verifies it. And so I think this is one of the very big challenges of getting the whole industry to the next level, to get institutions like Ben's and Tom's in a place of comfort where not only can they do transactions in the Hong Kong jurisdiction or the Singapore jurisdiction, but they can do the real transactions that they want to do, which is between those two jurisdictions, right? And that being solved then will flow money very actively into all of those chains, which will eventually find its way to DeFi protocols like Aave. But we really need to unlock all of that liquidity and that value by solving these plumbing interoperability problems, compliance identity problems, and doing that in a way that the people building the applications don't have to worry about it. Whether it's a TradFi application or a DeFi application, they should just get something like the internet with a set of working protocols and a set of working infrastructure components that they can compose into advanced applications that do valuable things with each other. So that's, I think, the world we all want to see and be part of. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you sharing your candid thoughts with all of us. Thank you. I think it was a great discussion and excited that we're all here together. Have a good rest of the conference, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.